Coming up, less than 24 hours after the Brooklyn Nets had to hold their collective breath around the injury to one Kevin Durant and that critical knee, we get an update from Shams Charania and Adrian Wojnarowski suggesting that the 2-week evaluation will certainly give us some framework for what the Brooklyn Nets need to accomplish in the absence of KD. We break it all down next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo.
Yes, my friends, it is a Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator of DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings. From DraftKings to FanDuel, he's got you covered. I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast. My boy, Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms, and let you know today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That's prizepicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. And Doug, all business today. As we know, Kevin Durant exited in the third quarter of the game last night, came back with speculative concern around what this could look like. And I think all things considered, as I said at the top, Woj and Shams both reporting 2 weeks and then reevaluation. That does feel like a good update around this injury.
Yeah, we were starting as the night wore on, just trying to read the tea leaves around the Durant injury, trying to figure out what, just basic things that were said were going to mean. I think we all pretty much understood that he was not going to be back next game, right? Like, I think that even just out of an abundance of caution, that would never have been the case. But now we get something that starts to look like more firm injury reporting deadlines. Like you said at the beginning, the idea here is with a sprained MCL, similar to the injury he had last season, that he is going to be reevaluated in 2 weeks. Want to clarify that reevaluated in 2 weeks does not mean coming back and playing in 2 weeks. So anyone that's going to hear 2 weeks and think that that's when you're going to see Kevin Durant return, that will almost definitely not be the case. Right. But at the same time, as Woj reported, that there was speculation and optimism that this would actually not sideline him for the 6 weeks that we saw last season. So they were able to use some context of last season's injury, frame it around this season. We know the Nets with injury reporting, it's a total disaster. So we're totally aware of that. But in general, they're to come out, because Woj is really tied into this front office, right? We know that. So it's for him to come out and give what I would consider to be a pretty positive update that it's going to be hopefully less than what we saw last season, is to some degree maybe best case scenario based on Kevin Durant grabbing his knee and limping off the court, right, to end the game. I know that a player of his stature, or really any player, getting injured is never good, right? But at that point, once someone is injured, all you can do is try to frame it and look at it in the grand sense of like what's happening with the team. And as we'll discuss in this show, 6 weeks around this timeline, even if that was the number, might not look like it did last season when he was injured, right? And just for a lot of different reasons. So that's where we stand right now with Durant, and I'm cautiously optimistic that it's going to be, shorter than last season.
I'm choosing to frame this as Kevin Durant has made the choice to take a 2-week vacation with the potential to extend it to a third or fourth week should he feel he requires a little extra relaxation midway through this NBA season. But to your point, we talked about this on yesterday's episode, might have been even in the bonus content. Always a good reminder, especially on post games, to go over to YouTube where we extend beyond the episodes and have some great interaction with fans, that this is just a week off from the timeline last year when he went down with the injury. And the Nets record was strikingly similar when he went down with that injury. The difference being that you feel, at least we think, more confident. We're going to talk about how they adjust the rotations for this team coming up here, and also the expectations over this stretch without him. I feel better, not only about the injury right now, but also about what this team can do. But what's interesting is you said 2 weeks to the evaluation. So that's going to put you just a couple of weeks out on the schedule. You're only going to have to go through 6 games effectively through the January 22nd with the Golden State Warriors. So It is Boston, OKC, San Antonio, Phoenix, Utah, and Golden State. Gets reevaluated. Give me another week out from there. That's going to push you through Philadelphia, Detroit, and New York. And then you're getting close to that LA, turning over the calendar into February. Do you feel, because we were talking before we started, fairly comfortable with everything the Nets and other teams in the NBA, the way they handle injuries and reporting them? I feel comfortable saying like a month feels like the starting point where he's back officially on the court. That feels like a minimum. It's a month before we think that he's going to step back out.
Yeah, I think a month is the minimum here. I think that would be shocked if it was less, just because I just think that's kind of how these things go. And just based on the way that the schedule sort of lines up here, I actually do think it probably will be close to the 6-week timeline, because this falls right in, like the 6 weeks is right in and around where the All-Star break is. And so if you're just looking to be able to possibly extend the timeline out a little bit to get to sort of buy yourself a few extra days on rehab and just conditioning and all that other stuff, the All-Star break right now is on February 19th. So we're recording this January 9th. February 19th is the All-Star break. It only, like, so the difference, it's funny because the difference between 4 weeks and 6 weeks, if you're just taking these as very strict timelines around when he would be back, is really only the difference of like 4 games or something like that. Right. No, sorry, it's only 3 games. So if you're just going by a month, and look, I understand we're making this up to some degree, right? Because you have to sort of just read what they say and trust that it's going to be in and around the case. But like I said, the difference between 4 weeks and 6 weeks is only 3 games, because when you factor in the All-Star break there, you buy a little time. So I think from that standpoint, there's a little bit of, like, quote, luck by having the All-Star break fall here, having this injury fall. Like, this is still, we said it's around the same timeline as last year. It is a week earlier than it happened last season. But I think there's some built-in, not context, there's some built-in logistical pieces that are in the Nets' favor here. And not to mention just what the schedule is. Like, the schedule is not a murderer's row of NBA teams that they're going to go through here. So feels a little different than last season. I'm positive last season when he got injured, our tone was, I mean, the season was so different last year too. There's so many pieces of context that were different around last year, i.e. worse than it is.
To be clear, not good.
I was speaking in generalities. Last year was a total S show, and this season is not that, right? So, but I know for a fact that even when they sat in second last year when he got hurt, we were already talking about, like, hey, play-in game incoming, right? This is what's going to happen. I don't have that feeling here. So anyway, long story short, with this timeline, I do think with the All-Star break, with the good news that it might not be 6 weeks, with the schedule being as it is, we just are not looking at the same situation. And it still sucks to lose Kevin Durant, who's been among the very best players in the NBA this year.
And that's 22 games from now until just the dates around it. February 15th, they play the Miami Heat. Then you get the All-Star break. Their next game is February 24th at Chicago. But March 1st, New York. Like, that would be 22 games that the Nets could potentially be without Kevin Durant.
A lot of games.
Like, a ton of games, right? I mean, it's a quarter of the season. Like, it's not a joke here. Like, you do need to accomplish something. And on the back end of the episode, we're going to discuss what they need to do in those 22 potential games here to still feel good about it and to maintain some level of consistency with where they are in the playoff picture. But coming up next, it's about how do you replace him inside of these rotations? Who do you look to on this roster to fill that void that Kevin Durant leaves behind?
All right, before we get to that, we'll talk to you about our friends over at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. On PrizePicks, you're not wrangling with salaries. You're not wrangling with lineups. You're just getting your entries in on PrizePicks, and you're going more or less on their player projections. It's so easy. Let me give you a little hint on PrizePicks. If you're going over there for the next time Brooklyn plays, let's go more on all the other role players for Brooklyn. Let's go more on the points for Kyrie. Let's go more on the assists for Ben Simmons. Let's throw some rebounds in there as well. PrizePicks has got it covered for all these different stats. They make it very, very easy. All you do is you pick 2 to 6 players. You figure out if they're going to score more or less on their PrizePicks projection. You can win up to 25 times your money. You're not competing against other people, those sharks in the water that you'll find at some of the other sites. And you're also just figuring out for every sport. They got the NBA, got NFL rolling into the playoffs here, MLB right around the corner. I can't believe spring is this close. All of these entries can be made in up to 60 seconds or less. Super easy. 30 states and Canada is where it's available. Download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up to play daily fantasy sports. First-time users are going to grab a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. If you deposit 100, PrizePicks will give you 100. If you deposit 50, PrizePicks is going to give you 50 all the way up and down that number line. Don't forget to enter the promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy.
What may not be so easy, Doug, for the Brooklyn Nets as we come back into the conversation is how you replace Kevin Durant inside of this lineup. Now, we feel, again, more confident this year than we would have last season. So many things are different and better coming into this. There's certainly an element of it that's going to be, hey, Kyrie Irving, this is your opportunity to step up and be a real leader for this team in Kevin Durant's absence. I think he's more than capable of doing that. He's shown himself to be someone who can carry, especially the offensive load. But what is your, it's not a one-to-one, but who's the guy that steps right into this starting lineup for the Brooklyn Nets in your eyes to fill in that starting minutes for Kevin Durant?
Okay, yeah. So just as a note about that, you don't replace Kevin Durant. I want to be really, really clear about that. You replace his minutes, but you just in no functional way can replace his production. He's just that good. He was among the league leaders in some really key areas, was a top 5 at worst MVP candidate as of this injury, right? That probably hurts that candidacy just because he'll probably end up missing too many games, though we'll see on that one. So you don't really replace.
Did we check in on cloning yet? Is that not?
I mean, I'm for it.
Yeah.
So especially in situations like this, very pro cloning. It depends who it is. I would.
You
give me the list.
Durant.
Here's the thing. You give me the list. I'll tell you if we're pro cloning.
I'll tell you who we clone or don't clone.
Right. Yeah. So maybe some of the moral and ethical issues with that, but that's okay. I'm a pretty good arbiter of stuff like that, I think. So with Kevin Durant, yeah, no, you don't replace him. But in terms of the starting lineup, I will say the good news is for the Nets is they do actually have a bunch of different ways to go here. I actually wouldn't be shocked if we see a couple of different looks from the Nets in terms of what they want to throw out for a starting lineup. My guess is to start, it's probably Harris, just because he gives a little bit of size. I mean, it's weird though, because he's been weirdly sort of out of the rotation-ish. Like he has not been playing that many minutes, but there's a little bit of size there. We know he can space the floor. He can actually guard a few of the different archetypes that KD was guarding, not all of them. And if it was, and I think it's probably between him and TJ Warren would be my guess. Like if you're looking to functionally replace some of the offense more, I think it's Warren. If you're looking to keep like a bench unit in place and you don't want to just totally tax Warren's minutes because he's coming back from injury over many seasons and so maybe working his way back in, then I think it's Harris. I think it's between those two guys. They bring obviously totally different skill sets to the table. And I just wouldn't be shocked if we saw a couple different versions here, right? Like if we saw just, hey, we're going to take a different look. What I don't think it's going to be a Seth Curry, because I think they will get worried about starting Curry and Kyrie next to each other as two smaller guards. I don't think it'll be that. But I could probably make cases. Once I understand that no one's replacing Kevin Durant, I can make cases for a bunch of different options here. So I think it will be interesting from that respect.
Yeah, I agree with you on the Seth Curry point, especially there too. The other part of it is you kind of mentioned it's how do you maybe not disrupt some of the continuity? Now, if it ends up being 22 games, that's a long enough time where, hey, we're going to figure out what we need to do here and we'll adjust back accordingly.
And by the way, there's going to be other injuries in here. Like these things don't happen in a vacuum. It's not like
22 games with no other issues to come up here.
Of course. Like other things are just going to happen here. They're a little long in the tooth that way. And so they're just not injury prone, but these guys have banked injuries. So, and that usually doesn't just mean pillars of health.
Yeah, so I'm curious about it too, because you mentioned there, it's like I agree with you on Seth Curry. I think Joe Harris is interesting. The lineup collectively gets a little bit smaller. I think it's the kind of thing where you look at Ben Simmons and Nicholas Claxton and say, hey, we're really going to need to be able to lean on you defensively. Like that's going to matter in a really big way here. I wonder how Jacques Vaughn looks at how quickly you try to maybe separate those two guys. So you leave your two best defensive players in positions to benefit both units. So that's going to be interesting too. I know that this will feel like a homer thing coming from me, given where I started this season. But I do think that, like, if you're talking about functional size, and I even said this on the last episode. This isn't a homer part. Markieff Morris was like, hey, I expect him to see more minutes here just by default because he's there. He has size. He can serve inside of that 4-5 role. And then it's Yuta Watanabe to me, though, too. Listen, he's shown the consistency on his corner threes. He's shown enough versatility when it comes to offensively and defensively. And I think that that's maybe like the biggest thing that you're trying to get some back of. I'm going to stop saying replace because it's the wrong word. You're trying to get something back from what you're losing from Kevin Durant. A lot of it to me is the functionality. So when you say Joe Harris, and we love Joe Harris, but I don't think about Joe Harris being able to make some like key passes in key moments. I don't think about Joe Harris being able to scramble defensively and get out on recoveries on perimeter shooters. And I do wonder, I think there's a question here about, will Jacques Vaughn look at it and say, we've lost a massive, irreplaceable offensive piece. Let's lean even further into what we've been doing defensively and try to pull teams down. Or do we try to maintain that same mode of what we've been doing on the offensive end and try to rotate guys through there? But, and you said it there, I also think that it's going to be matchup to matchup, game to game. What makes sense here for us? Maybe we go a little Markieff Morris minutes. Maybe we use Yuta Watanabe. Maybe there are some matchups where it's small enough and all of a sudden the Seth Curry and Joe Harris getting big lifts actually makes it possible for you to bury a couple of bad teams along the way. So I think it's going to be very matchup to matchup based. I wouldn't hate if anyone off this list does kind of emerge, and Joe would be the most consistent guy who has starting reps to say, hey, I've done this before. There's some level of reliability about what I can give you.
Yeah, so the Nets are interesting, right? Because I do think each of their pieces is not perfect, but they each bring something different in a good way. And I think this is again speaks to why I think we're going to see different combinations. I mean, if you just look at last night against the Heat, Simmons didn't even really close the game. We talked about it briefly on the podcast, but they opted, once Durant was out of the lineup, like they did not want to pair Simmons and Claxton together. I don't think that's going to be long-term what they do. I think they have to probably figure out a way for Simmons and Claxton to coexist without KD. We're going to talk at length about Simmons later this week because I think there's a lot of stuff that we probably need to dive into on just his game specifically. But if you look at last night, like I said, Simmons wasn't in the closing lineup. It was Curry, Watanabe, Royce, Claxton, and Kyrie. Now, I don't think like they're not just going to go back to Simmons like off the bench or anything, but I think when you run down the list of the Kevin Durant minutes replacements, you are getting a little and giving a little with each guy that you put in there, right? Like with some, okay, like, I'm not going to compare any of these guys to KD. I'm going to compare them all to each other here. With Harris, you get better. This is not, Harris, you theoretically get better 3-point shooting, right? And get a little bit more size. With Yuta, you get a lot of length, good 3-point shooting. Is not going to be like any kind of like offensive engine. With Curry, you get a little bit more on ball, a lot of it maybe on ball creation, can score at 3 levels. You give up a ton defensively because he's really, really small. With Warren, you get a lot of some versions of all the things I talked about with all the other guys. I do worry that I don't think you get 34 minutes a game out of him, right? Like, so you're going to, that's huge where I can imagine some of the other guys ramping it up to 34 minutes a game. I don't think I can see that with Warren. So you're going to have to supplement between some of those other guys. So I think like with each guy, we just make the list and say, here are the good things, here are the bad things. The good news is, unlike last season, we actually have a list with guys with enough superlatives. Last season, that was not the case.
And the one other guy that I will throw into this mix here when we're talking, because you mentioned Seth Curry, and then we start to move up this list, and it's just going to be 36 to 38 minutes. That's what we need to replace here without Kevin Durant. Edmund Sumner does become interesting here because he's just long enough. I think if we're talking about the smaller guys on this roster, but that then can add to the defensive value here, that'll be interesting for me to see too, because I can see a world where he's on the court with Kyrie Irving, and maybe that's the way in which you get Seth Curry out there, but you don't put him with Kyrie to create those issues, right? So you said Warren about there's going to be a restriction there. I think Sumner, we know he's coming off of injury as well.
By the way, real quick with Warren, I'm making that up. Like I've never seen anything where there's a restriction. I just know they really haven't pressed his minutes, even in situations where it looked like they were going to, right? So like I'm only saying it based on not on actual reporting about Warren, but more about just having looked at this over the course of the season. They've had time to run him tons of minutes, and they've just chosen not to.
Yeah, and there's been stretches, by the way, like for Edmund Sumner, it's not dissimilar. Like there was a stretch at the start of December where he's playing 14, 13, 15, 27, 12. Then they brought him all the way down, popped up for a couple of big minutes, and now he's only played 10, 11, 4. And that can be a part of Royce O'Neal and TJ Warren playing a little bit more and just trying to refine some of these rotations. But Jacques Vaughn, if nothing else, has been consistent in saying, hey, there's going to be these flows where I kind of move into, it's your time now. This is going to be your run for the next 3 or 4 games. And you mentioned Warren, you mentioned Sumner, you mentioned Curry, you mentioned Harris. Those are all guys that are coming off of injuries in different forms and fashion. So I think there's been that buildup here, and that will be fascinating, which is what we're going to talk about coming up next. What do the Nets need to do over, we're saying 22 games, over the next 18 to 22 games in the potential absence of Kevin Durant? What do the Nets need to achieve over that timeline to make sure it's not like last year where they lost 11 games and really found themselves in a difficult uphill battle at the back end of the season for multiple reasons, which we will break down next. Before we do, though, friends, going to tell you about our other friends. They're over at BetOnline. BetOnline is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You get over right there right now. Listen, maybe you want to hedge your bets. Let a few games play out for Brooklyn. Then go check in on those title odds. They start to slip a little bit. You start thinking about putting in a little bit of a larger wager. You get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from pro football, college bowl season. The big title game is happening tonight. And of course, the basketball season, along with all your other major sports. Head over to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. Bet online. It's where the game starts.
Oh, and you know what's coming up here. It's tax season. Tax season, you have to head over to TurboTax. And here's the thing. With TurboTax, you don't do your taxes. You meet with an expert who will do them for you. TurboTax experts can relieve you from the stress of taxes and filing. So what you can do is not do taxes. Show your eyes things that are not taxes. Unpack a moving box of not taxes. Taste not taxes. That tastes delicious. Sing not taxes a lullaby. You see where I'm going with this. Hope not taxes sleeps through the night. TurboTax wants to let you know that with them, you are not doing your taxes. One of those experts is. It's 100% expert guarantee that an expert will do those taxes from start to finish so you can relax. That has got to feel good. It just feels good to be done with the taxes. Go to TurboTax and don't do your taxes. Visit TurboTax.com to learn more. Intuit TurboTax, full service products only. Video meeting while expert does your taxes required. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees.
All right, so we close out today's episode thinking about this potential 18 to 22 game loss of Kevin Durant and what the Brooklyn Nets need to accomplish. We know, and you actually mentioned this, I think, in the pre-show, that they were right there in the second position last season when Kevin Durant went down in the Eastern Conference. But we did highlight at the top, you've got the San Antonios, the Pistons, the Knicks are mixed in there, Golden State without key players, Phoenix coming up in short order, also dealing with injuries right now, and the Wizards and other teams. There's tough matchups mixed in there too. But I think for me, the biggest thing that they need to accomplish here is, obviously, you can't sit here and go 5-17 over 22 games. That's going to hurt you from a lot of different angles. But as long as they're treading water, and I actually am cautiously optimistic they can do more than just tread water. The biggest thing to me is don't start burning dudes out surviving this run. And that's where the depth of this roster matters. But do you look at that schedule in those 22 games and say they can go 500? They can go 3 games over 500? Is it unreasonable to set a somewhat lofty expectation after losing Kevin Durant?
No, it's not unreasonable. I mean, if you look at some of the on-off numbers with KD this season, obviously they're worse with KD off the court by about 4 points. Yeah, total shocker. I will say last year they were worse last year with him off the court than they are this year, right? They're much closer to even than, it's still negative, but they're much closer to even than they are. Now, part of that is because with Kyrie on the court this season and KD off, the numbers are actually positive. They're +5 in net rating with Kyrie and no KD. So it's a good starting place with just like the way the team is made up in terms of just like the team can survive in this way. Another difference in last season, and you mentioned some of the schedule, like this will always change, right? Like, it's like based on what the Nets have and what the other teams have in general, as a bird's eye view of this right now, the schedule is not very intimidating. So that's good. So, 500 or better over the stretch wouldn't be totally crazy to think about. Another difference this year in terms of expectation as opposed to last year, if you remember last season, there was the East was very crowded with teams who had motivation to kind of try to make that playing game. If you remember toward the end of the season, even during this stretch, we were like, hey man, just remember the bottom of this East is filled with teams that are wanting to kind of make the playoffs. The East is a little different right now. After the play-in, so last year it was like, hey, are they even going to get into the play-in? Right? Like, forget the seeding. There was some problems. Now at the bottom of the play-in, once you get past the Hawks at 10, the rest of the teams, I don't think have any, delusions of grandeur when it comes. Like the
Right.
Wizards are 6 games under 500. The Raptors are 6 games under 500, could be sellers. So I think you're only actually even looking at the top 10 teams as being kind of motivated at this point in the East. And even that could change with like the Bulls. I gotta be honest with you, like how confident are you in the Heat right now? So I think there are other. I just think the season's setting up so much different. Besides just that the Nets are better, right?
Yeah.
Like I think that this season it just isn't as scary as it was last season. So in terms of expectation, the expectation is here to stay out of the play-in. I think that's always got to be, that is number one. Forget number one seed in the East right now. Forget even like home court advantage, all that other stuff. Right now, you don't want to be playing with your life on the line like they were last season.
Right.
And I don't actually think, if I were to set an expectation right now, that is where they're going to, I don't think we're going to be in that conversation as much over these next 22 games or whatever. Feel free. I'm going to leave it open to feel free to evaluate this in 10 days and see how
With
it's
my
going.
option to
And see how
redetermine
it's
how I
going.
feel.
Yeah, exactly. But I just think that the NBA is setting up a little differently than it was last season. And I just think the Nets are just so much better prepared to withstand something like this than they were in the past. Not to mention what happens at the trade deadline. We'll couch that for now because I think that I think we don't know nearly enough now to know what that's going to be like. But just in general, I have an expectation here, 500, maybe a little better. I think that's fine. A little worse, I think that'd be fine too. But with the expectation that hey, the eyes are still on the playoff prize.
Yeah, you look at it because I'm a couple of things. Then I want to ask an interesting question around the rest of the Eastern Conference right now. We said this on yesterday's episode. They do have a 4.5 game lead on the 6th seed Pacers, a 5 game lead on the 7th seed New York Knicks. So to your point about where can you stay? Well, you've got 4 to 5 games to play with here to not fall below the 6th or 7th seed potentially. And that's assuming that those teams, a team like the Knicks, who are 22 and 18, they're above 500, but that means they got to play 15-5 ball over 20 games in order to make up that ground and get over top of you. So, Milwaukee, Cleveland, yeah, I would expect them to get past us potentially over the course of their schedule. Same thing is weird, although you mentioned Embiid and that injury, Philadelphia is a weird team this year in a lot of ways too. So that's the first piece of it. But I find more interesting too is, to me, 2 things. It's one of the rare times when I would say, hey, if we have to kind of burn Kyrie Irving over 22 games, knowing that it's to get Kevin Durant back, it's this weird, I'll sacrifice my second best player to make sure that my best player comes back in a really good spot, because the Nets are 40 games through their season right now. If we think 22, well, guess what? You're going to have 20 games when he steps back onto the court to get him back into rhythm, back in the flow, right up to speed, ramping up and everything. So the windows are a little tight here. But this is an open-ended question. We need not answer it. I do find it interesting, though, the way some of these other Eastern Conference teams, you mentioned the deadline, how are they looking at it now, saying, oh, even a Cleveland, a Philadelphia, maybe even the Pacers, any of these teams that are right there, the Knicks saying, boy, maybe we should try to make a little bit of a move here, because we could have a 20 to 22 game window where it's not even about being better than the Nets. It's just about being ahead of them in the standings when Kevin Durant comes back and knowing that you can hang on to a playoff spot. So I will be curious to see how this motivates other Eastern Conference teams who are maybe thinking about being sellers. Miami, hey, listen, maybe we think we can stick around here as opposed to cutting off a few pieces. So that's, to me, fascinating to watch for as we go forward too.
Yeah, look, and it's not just that. It's not just the Nets here. We mentioned it briefly on the podcast yesterday that the Sixers are dealing with some issues around Embiid right now too.
Yeah.
And I don't think his has the same kind of timeline. I just wanted to look real quick if I could see it. I don't see the timeline on him, but it's a foot injury for him, and that's super scary when you think about what has happened for him in the past and just the overall size and just how he plays. So there are some teams that are a little vulnerable right now in terms of health. There are some other teams that are in weird spots, like the Pacers. I mean, they're going to be buyers. They're so young. It's just they're kind of overachieving as a young team. I think they probably just can stand pat and feel good about the future, sort of let the chips fall where they may with the way the team is. Miami's interesting. It's always tough to know exactly where they view themselves. I probably think they view themselves as still contenders if they're completely healthy. And they've just had struggle with health. And look, and the health thing too. Is all when you take the average age of a team and the guys who play a lot of minutes for your team, when your best players are older, this is just what happens. This isn't rocket science, right? We're not Adam and Doug MDs bringing you some groundbreaking medical information. As you get older and you have tons of miles on your legs as a player, you are going to be more prone to injury. We're seeing this from players among the best players this season who are struggling with injuries. We got KD on the shelf now. Obviously, I just mentioned Embiid. You go over to LA with the Clippers, who just can't keep Kawhi on the court for any kind of time, and PG's been in and out of the lineup. Obviously, Anthony Davis is out for the Lakers, and LeBron's missed a bunch of games this season. Chris Paul's out of the lineup. Like, these are the older guys. The older crowd gets hurt, right? And like, this is just what it's going to be. So I think sometimes with teams' motivations, it's always going to be couched into where they are with their own stuff. I think no team is perfect right now. Oh, by the way, I didn't even mention Curry. No team is perfect right now. I don't think this will change too much of how any team views their individual prospects. I do think that we are in a situation with the NBA, though, where it's just a little more fluid than we've seen in the past also. And I think that actually helps the Nets. Like, I think it helps them in this situation. It's totally wide open. Right. It's going to be hard to get teams' motivations. They're going to have most teams are going to have trouble evaluating their own current situation compared to the rest. And I actually wonder if that will stop some teams from making crazy stuff. Right. And so I think just the nature of the NBA helps the Nets more than anything else.
Yeah, and I do think as we'll close out here and we'll see where this goes. Obviously, the next game for the Brooklyn Nets be Thursday night against the Boston Celtics, which will look different now for them. But the other thing is this certainly probably pauses the Nets evaluation of what they maybe wanted to do at the deadline and decisions they may want to make, which we can get into a little bit deeper.
We'll talk about that later in the week. Yeah. I barely mentioned it. I mean, the deadline's the 9th. He's not going to be back, right? Like, he's not going to be back prior to the deadline. So the Nets might again find themselves in a somewhat tricky spot here of what to do.
And maybe even tea leaves on if they make or don't make a move around the deadline may give you an indication about how they feel about what's going on with Kevin Durant. So there's going to be guess what, guys? A lot of things for us to ruminate on here in the coming weeks.
Yeah, we got a ton this week. Like I said, we're going to get into Simmons too. There's some real disturbing stuff with statistically when it comes to Simmons I want to break down. So we'll get into that. Maybe we'll get some more clarity around this KD stuff too. We're recording this like literally after the first reports. So I think that there's some chance we even have more clarity on that situation. In the meantime, make sure you are subscribed over on Locked On Nets YouTube. Everyone that jumped into the live show from last night, like, just so much appreciation for everyone that jumps in here. These things are doing bananas numbers for us. Like, we're hitting some of our all-time highs and just continue to kind of spike this thing on the graph. And that's all because you're heading over there. You're subscribed to Locked On Nets YouTube. You're getting the notifications. We're going live. It's all this. It's kind of a snowball effect. So really appreciative of what's happening there. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Nets over on YouTube.
In the locker room, play the song and sing along. Picking Up Slack by Cake.
Oh, well, one of the all-time guys. Stop me a little short there. Yeah. I mean, someone else wrote the song. I don't think Cake wrote the song, right? They have names.
No. You go to the fridge. There's a piece of cake, and boy, do they crank out the hits.
Well, there you go. One of the all-time great poets. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.